Hello guys and welcome back to the Law on Obligations and Contracts series. So, nandito na nga tayo ngayon sa ating second part ng series which is the contracts. Okay, so mag-uumpisa tayo this time from the general provisions. So, gaya ng obligations, meron ding general provisions and contracts. So, this is based on the Civil Code Articles 1305 to 1317. Okay? So, mag-start na po tayo sa general provisions of contracts. Ang magiging content ng video na ito ay nahati sa 5. So, bali, first, we will define what is contracts. Second, we will determine the different elements regarding contracts. Number 3, what are the different types or classifications of contracts? Number 4, what are the different stages or what are the stages of in the formation of a contract? And lastly, what are the 5 characteristics of a contract? So, ayan. Yan po yung 5 content natin. So, umpisahan natin sa number 1. What is a contract? Okay, so what is the meaning of a contract? The meaning of a contract is based on the Article 1305. So, sabi dito, a contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some service. Okay, so sa Tagalog, ang contract ay kontrata. So, every day, hindi nyo napapansin, pero you engage into various contracts, such as kapag bumili kayo, and kapag meron kayong pinahiram sa mga kaibigan nyo, so, nagkakaroon ng contract, okay? Usually, ang contract is entered by two persons, okay? Pero, in practical scenario, pwedeng hindi lang two persons ang involved dito, so, pwedeng two or more persons, pero, pwede ba na isang person lang ang involved sa isang kontrata? Actually, mukhang hindi, okay? Parang wala akong maisip actually, okay? Na ganung klaseng contract wherein isang person lang. So, at least two persons. Okay? And then, okay, ano bang meron dito sa contract? So, by the way, ang contract, okay, in relation to obligation, so kunin ko muna yung highlighter natin. Ang obligation, pwedeng merong, pag sinabi nating merong obligation, pwedeng walang kontrata. Okay? Pero kapag merong contract, automatically merong obligation. Kasi nga, kung babalikan natin yung mga different sources of obligations, isa sa mga sources ay contract. Okay? So, every time na meron tayong contract, automatically merong obligation within the contract. Okay? Pero hindi ibig sabihin na merong obligation. Yung obligation na yon ay because of a contract. So, pwedeng ang obligation na yon ay because of the law. Pwede rin na ang obligation na yon ay because of the, what do you call this? Because of a delict or a commission of a crime. Di ba? So ayun. And yung other sources pa natin. Okay? So, ayun. Yun yung pagkakaiba ng contract from an obligation. Okay? Pero, gusto ko lang i-point out, gusto ko lang i-emphasize na every time na meron tayong contract, automatically merong obligation, okay, na nasa loob ng contract. And usually, kung ito yung contract, okay, may mga obligations sa loob ng contract. So, pwedeng isa lang ang obligation, such as mga unilateral contracts. Pwede rin there are two or more obligations within a single contract. So, Diyan papasok yung mga bilateral obligations, tapos may mga certain provisions pa siya or stipulations, okay? So, yun yung contract in relation to obligation, okay? So, next, let's move on to the elements of a contract. Pag sinabi nating elements, ang elements actually is the building block, okay? So, what compose or what comprise the contract? So, actually, there may be 3 types of elements, okay, in a contract. So, number 1, we have the essential elements. Number 2, we have the natural elements. And lastly, the accidental elements. Pero, hindi naman lagi na nag-i-exist yung lahat na yan. Lahat ng essential together with natural and accidental. Not all the time. Pero, tatandaan nyo, okay, itong essential elements, okay, itong number 1, which under essential elements, meron tayong consent, object, and cause. Kailangan, okay, required yan. Laging nag-i-exist dapat yan para magkaroon ng isang kontrata. So, in any type of contract, kailangan yung mga essential elements na yan. Kasi kung wala yan, hindi mo siya pwedeng tawagin isang kontrata. Okay? So, kaya nga tinawag siyang essential element. Kailangan or required, kumbaga. Okay? So, yung number 2 and number 3 po, hindi po required elements yung mga yan. So, pwedeng meron yung mga yan, pwede rin hindi rin siya nag-exist sa isang contract. Okay? So, i-define natin yung number 2 and number 3. Kasi yung number 1, meron tayong separate. Actually, yan yung magiging next video natin. Yung mga different essential elements. Mag-go into detail tayo dyan sa consent, object, and the cause. Okay? Pero for now, okay, ang importante, alam nyo na yung tatlong yan yung essential elements natin. Or kailangan na mag-exist yung tatlong yan in order for something to be considered a contract. Okay? So, number 2. Punta tayo sa natural elements. What are natural elements? Actually, natural elements are elements that are initially present in some certain contracts. Okay? Inulit ko. Pag sinabi nating natural elements, nag-e-exist siya initially. Okay? At the birth of the contract, nag-e-exist siya. Pero, pwede siyang tanggalin. Okay? Pwede siyang alisin. Okay? So, yun yung mga natural elements. So, for example, in a contract of sale, meron tayong natural elements such as warranty against eviction and warranty against hidden defects. So, itong mga warranties na ito, itong mga natural elements na ito, nag-e-exist siya at the moment na ma-form yung contract of sale. However, through the stipulation of the parties, pwedeng tanggalin yung mga elements na yan or yung mga specifically warranties na mga yan. Okay ba? Okay, pero pag sinabi rin natural element, for example, itong mga nabanggit natin dito, warranty against eviction and warranty against hidden defects, hindi ibig sabihin na nag-e-exist siya initially in a contract of sale ay nag-e-exist na siya sa lahat ng uri ng contract. Hindi po. Certain contracts lang po siya nag-e-exist. So, specifically, nag-e-exist siya sa contract of sale. Pero sa, let's say, other contracts such as a contract of loan, maaring hindi siya nag-e-exist itong mga dalawang to, okay? So, yun yung natural elements. So, inuulit ko, ang natural elements, initially nag-e-exist siya in some certain contracts. However, pwede mo siyang alisin, diba? Or tanggalin through the stipulation of the parties later on, okay? However, yun nga, yung number 1, hindi pwedeng alisin yan, okay? Hindi pwedeng alisin yung essential, okay? Next, number 3. Accidental elements. So, these are the stipulation of the parties such as interest in a loan. Okay. So, by the way, ang accidental elements, initially, hindi siya nag-e-exist sa isang contract. Unlike sa natural element, di ba? Yung natural element, nag-e-exist siya at the start or at the when the contract was formed. However, accidental elements does not exist, okay, habang ginagawa yung contract or when the contract is formed. It must be stipulated by the parties, okay? So, yun yung mga accidental elements. Yun yung pagkakaiba niya from natural elements. Yung natural elements, nag-e-exist na siya, pwede siyang tanggalin later on. In accidental elements, pero hindi siya mag-exist initially, pero pwede siyang ilagay, okay? Or isama dun sa contract natin, or stipulate dun sa contract natin, okay? So, those are the elements of a contract. Okay? So, punta naman tayo sa mga different classifications of a contract. So, we have many classifications. Pero yung mga babanggitin lang natin dito, yung mga very important na classification. So, number 1, this is the most important na classification para sa, for the purpose of discussing contracts. Okay? So, this is the classification of contracts according to perfection. Okay? So, there are 3, consensual, real, and formal. Or, pwede rin nating tawagin tong solemn. Okay, so ayan. Number 1, or letter A, consensual contracts. These contracts are perfected by mere consent, object, and cause. Okay, so, itong mga to, kung maalala nyo, based dun sa first slide natin or previous slide natin, these are the essential elements. Okay, so consensual contracts, ang mga ito, okay na, sapat na ang mga essential elements para ito ay ma-form, okay? Pero tatandaan nyo, there are certain contracts na hindi lang yung mga essential elements ang required para ma-form ito or para matawag siya na contract. Ibig sabihin, hindi lang COC or consent, object, or cause ang kanilang essential element. So, generally kasi, di ba, Under essential element, tatlo lang yung nilagay natin, okay? Pero there are some certain contracts wherein hindi lang consent, object, and cause ang kanilang essential element, okay? So, those are yung letter B, real contracts. So, what are real contracts? They are perfected by consent, object, and cause plus delivery. Okay, so delivery will be added as an essential element of real contract. So, may example pala tayo dito. So, letter A, consensual. Example ng mga consensual contract, sales, partnership, real mortgage. Okay, pero may mga other examples pa tayo dyan na hindi nababanggit. Okay, next, letter B, we have a contract of pledge, contract of loan, and contract of deposit. So, sa mga kontratang ito, hindi sapat na meron lang tayong mga essential elements such as the consent, object, and cause. Kailangan din na i-deliver yung object or prestation within the contract. Okay? So, yun. Okay? Tatandaan nyo yun. Okay, so next, last tayo. Last type of contract or classification of contract according to perfection. So, we have the solemn or formal contract. Pag sinabi natin formal contract, ito yung mga contract which are perfected by COC or the consent, object, and cause plus formalities required by law. So, for example, a contract of donation of real property requires that the donation must be in writing parang kumbaga duly acknowledged before a notary public. So in short, kailangan in public instrument po siya. Okay? Both the initiation of the donation and the acceptance of the donee. So yun yung formality required by law in case of donation of real property. Hindi po sapat na meron lang tayong consent, object, and cause. Hindi po yun sapat. Kailangan na-follow din yung proper formality required by law. So yun yung sa donation. Pag chattel mortgage naman, ang pagkakaalala ko dito, kailangan in writing siya or what, okay? And ganun din si anti-crisis, kailangan in writing siya, okay? So yun yung mga classifications of contracts according to their perfection. Ibig sabihin, ito yung mga requirement nila upang, okay? Parang kumbaga iba-iba sila kung paano sila na form or paano sila mapa-perfect, okay? So this consensual, real, and formal, okay? Next, according to relation to other contracts naman. Okay, so from the name of the classification itself, according to relation to other contracts. So how do they stand compared to other contracts? So number one, we have principal contract. So siguro kayo dito, what do you call this, familiar dun sa dalawang to, yung principal and accessory. Kasi dun sa obligations tayo, na meron tayong na-discuss na principal and accessory obligations, wherein yung mga principal obligations, they can stand on their own. However, accessory obligations are dependent upon principal obligations. So, ganun din dito sa number 2, according to relation to other contract. Principal contracts can exist on their own. Okay? However, accessory contracts can only exist if it depends upon a principal contract. So, ayan. Example ng principal contract ay contract of sales, contract of loan. Okay? Next, how about contract of pledge? It is considered an accessory contract only. Why? Hindi naman pwedeng magkaroon ng contract of pledge kung walang sinisecure na obligation. Kasi usually, ang pledge ay ginagawa siya para ma-secure ang isang obligation such as a contract of loan. Okay? Nagpa-pledge tayo, nagbo-mortgage tayo, nagga-guarantee tayo, usually, merong loan na involved dito. Okay? So, itong mga to, hindi sila pwedeng mag-exist without a principal contract such as a loan. Okay? So, yun yung accessory contract. How about preparatory contract? Okay? Pag sinabi nating preparatory contract, these are contracts wherein they are needed for the formation of subsequent contracts. Okay, so for example, in the contract of partnership, once na bumuo tayo ng contract of partnership, magkakaroon pa ng other contract subsequently. So that partnership na nabuo natin, pwede siyang mag-engage into a contract of sales with other businesses. Pwede rin mag-engage itong partnership na to with contract of employment to employees, di ba? Yung mga gusto niyang employ. And many other contracts na pwede pa. Ganon din si agency. Okay? Itong agency naman, actually, partnership and agency have their separate topics or separate titles within the Civil Code of the Philippines. So ayan, medyo mahaba-habang topic actually itong mga nominate contracts na ito. Okay, so ayan. So those are, okay, by the way, ang preparatory contract ay principal contract din. Okay? So partnership contracts and agencies or contract of agencies are also principal contracts or they can exist on its own. Okay? So ayan, according to relation to other contracts. So next, number 3, we have according to parties obliged. So sino yung mga merong obligation within the contract. So meron tayong unilateral contract. Under unilateral contract, only one party is obliged. So for example, donation. Only one party is obliged to give a prestation such as an object of donation. Kung magdo-donate man siya ng real property or what, di ba? Kung ano-ano mang klaseng bagay. So, siya lang obliged na magbigay. Okay? Yung kabilang party, walang ibibigay na kapalit kasi, syempre, kung ganun man, hindi mo na siya matatawag na donation kung ganun man. Pag comodatum naman, ito yung magpapahiram ka. So, pag magpapahiram ka, walang kapalit yun. Kasi kapag pinahiram mo yung, let's say, laptop mo, pero merong bayad, hindi na yun comodatum. Lease na yun. Contract of lease na yun kasi may bayad na. Okay? Ang comodatum, essentially, gratuitous siya. Ibig sabihin, unconditional siya, walang ibibigay yung kabilang party. So, in this case, unilateral, only one party is obliged. Under bilateral naman, both parties are obliged to give something to each other. So, example, sales. So, ang dalawang parties within sales, we have the seller and the buyer. So, si seller, obliged siya na i-deliver yung goods na binenta. However, si buyer naman, obliged din siya na bayaran yung kung ano man yung binili niya. Ganon din sa barter. Yung barter kasi ito yung exchange of goods naman. Okay? So, non-monetary to. Itong barter. Non-monetary yung binibigay ng dalawang parties. Okay? So, next, let's go to number 4. According to name naman. When we say name, okay, ayan. We have the nominate and innominate contracts. So, pag sinabi nating nominate contracts, the law gives it a special name or designation. So, ano yung mga example? Itong mga to, yung mga nababanggit natin kanina na example actually. So, actually, lahat ng nabanggit natin example from the previous classifications, lahat yung mga yun, nominate contracts kasi may pangalan. Such as sales, loan, partnership, donation, ano pa yung mga nabanggit natin kanina, comodatum, pledge, mortgage, and lahat ng nabanggit natin. Okay? Basta meron siyang pangalan under the law, they are considered nominate contracts. Okay? So, parang kumbaga merong rule. Okay? Merong rule, parang kumbaga meron tayong pagtitignan ng guidelines kung ano bang meron dito sa mga specific contracts na ito. Okay? However, innominate contracts are, okay, not named under the law. So, the law does not give it a special name or designation. Okay? Pero, in this slide or in this lecture, we classified it into 4. So, first, do ut des, do ut facias, facio ut facias, and facio ut des. So, ang English translations na mga to ay I give that you may give, I give that you may do, I do that you may do, and I do that you may give. So, these are the 4 classifications of innominate contracts. Okay? So, when dealing with innominate contracts, so, inuulit natin, ang pagkakaiba kasi ng nominate contract at innominate contract, yung mga nominate contract, meron silang rules under the law, mababasa, specifically civil code. Ito mga to, sales, loans, partnerships, donation, mababasa sila under the civil code. May mga certain guides doon na makikita nyo, di ba? Kumbaga, when dealing with certain circumstances, alam natin ang gagawin natin kasi merong guideline by the law. However, innominate contracts ay walang guidelines si law. Pero, ang sabi dito, according to Article 1307, when dealing with innominate contracts, ito yung mga susundan natin. Okay, ganito. Number 1, itong innominate contract ba na ito, may mga stipulations ba yung parties natin? Okay? So, syempre, masusunod, number 1, actually, in order of priority ito, number 1, masusunod kung ano man yung na-stipulate ng mga parties doon. Kung gusto nila na ganito, ganyan, masusunod yun. As long as hindi siya bawal or hindi siya pinagbabawal sa batas, hindi siya against sa morals, hindi siya against sa public order, public policy, and good customs, di ba? So, okay lang siya. Okay? Masusunod yung stipulation ng mga parties. Okay? However, pag hindi masyadong malinaw yung stipulation ng mga parties, punta tayo sa number 2, rules governing obligations and contracts. Okay? Pero kung minsan kasi, yung mismong obligations and contracts, medyo, medyo naka-generalize. Okay? It refers to all kinds of contracts, di ba? So, naka-generalize yung mga yan. So, kapag hindi pa rin natin parang kumbaga, hindi pa rin natin siya maintindihan or ma-deal with number 2, yung mga nabasa natin under obligations and contracts, punta tayo sa number 3, which is rules governing the most analogous contract, okay? So, kung yung ating innominate contract ay mukhang sales, okay? We bring the rules governing the law on sales, di ba? Kasi yun yung most analogous. Pag sinabi kasi nating most analogous, parang yung pinakakahawig niyang contract. So, although parang siyang contract of sale, pero hindi siya talaga sale. Okay? Kasi hindi niya na-meet yung yung definition or requisites ng isang sale, contract of sale. So, ayun. Pero pwedeng gamitin yung rules on contract of sales para doon sa innominate contract na yun. Okay? And lastly, paano kung walang analogous contract na pwedeng mag-deal with that innominate contract? So, we refer to number 4, the customs of the place, or kung ano ang nakagawian sa lugar na yon, yun ang susundin. Okay? So, yun yung, ito yung rules natin when dealing with innominate contracts or contracts that are named and that are not named under the law. Okay? So, next. We have our 5th classification. So, according to risks involved. Okay? So, we have commutative and aleatory. So, first, commutative. When the undertaking of one party is considered the equivalent of the other. Okay, so, for example, in a contract of sale, yung binibigay ng bawat isa, binibigay ng seller and then the buyer sa bawat isa ay considered of equivalent value. So, for example, yung binabayad ni buyer, yun yung fair market value or yun yung price, di ba? Yun yung price, and usually that is the fair market value nung specific thing na yun. Ganon din, di ba? So, nagkakaroon ng equivalent exchange. Ganon din sa contract of lease. Nagkakaroon dito ng equivalent exchange. However, in an aleatory contract, hindi sigurado or it depends upon a certain event. Okay? Kung ano ang marireceive ng both parties. Okay? For example, in a contract of insurance, yung nagpapa-insure, nagbabayad siya ng periodic, what do you call this, premium, di ba? So, fix yon. However, yung marireceive niya na benefit, it depends upon an uncertain event. Okay? Kapag nangyari, di ba? So, medyo may malaki-laki siya compared dun, may malaki-laki siyang matatanggap compared dun sa binayad niyang premium. However, kung hindi nangyari yung sa yung sa condition natin in contract of insurance, ayun, lugi siya. So, may certain amount din siya marireceive siguro. Depende yan sa provisions nung contract of insurance. Okay? Meron din tayo ditong sale of hope. So, for example, bumibili kayo ng lotto ticket. Okay, fix yung amount ng lotto ticket, so 20 pesos, pero it's either you will receive 0 or a certain amount beyond 20 pesos, di ba? Or milyones, di ba? Kung nakaka-jackpot ka. Okay, so yun yung aleatory contracts. Okay? So next, number 6, we have according to cost. Okay, so kung maalala nyo yung cost, it's one of the essential elements. Okay? Consent, object, and cost. Okay, so ano yung cost? Onerous, gratuitous, and remuneratory. So, in onerous contracts, the cost has a valuable consideration. So, for example, ganito. Example na lang natin. In a contract of sale, the object is kung ano yung binebenta. At ang cost ay yung price nung binebenta. Okay? So, yung price nung binebenta has a valuable consideration kasi usually it will be paid in money. Okay? Next, in gratuitous contract. Okay, what is a gratuitous contract? Ito naman, the cost is purely generosity or walang valuable consideration masyado. Okay, so in comodatum, a comodatum is a gratuitous contract. Sabi natin kanina to, di ba? Essentially gratuitous. So, ang object under a comodatum is kung ano yung bagay na ipapahiram mo. Tama? Okay? However, ano ang cost nun? It's purely the generosity. Parang kumaga, ano bang cause? Ano bang reason, di ba? It's purely the generosity. Pinahiram mo. Pinahiram lang. So, walang valuable consideration dun sa cause. Ganon din sa donation, di ba? Kapag binigay mo ang isang bagay, okay, wala kang matatanggap na valuable consideration. Kasi ang cost lang nun is purely the generosity or the liberality of the kung sino yung nagdo-donate, okay, or nagpapahiram in case of comodatum, okay? So, those are gratuitous contract. Letter C naman, ano yung letter C? Remuneratory contract. So, the cost is based on the services or benefits already received. So, for example, in the contract of employment, kapag nakapag-render na yung employee ng kanyang services, so ayun, that's the cost of our ibibigay na remuneration or yung salary niya, di ba? So based on services or benefits already received from the service of that certain employee, okay? So wag kayong maglala, pagdating natin ng next video, we will tackle in detail yung mga different or yung mga essential elements ng ating contract. So those are the consent object and the cost, okay? So next, last classification na itatakal natin dito is the according to the binding force. So when we say binding force, gaano ka ba mababind sa contract na ito? Okay, so actually naka-arrange itong mga to from the most binding, letter A, and the least binding or no binding at all. Actually itong void contract, no binding at all. So ayan. Okay? Pero actually pag-aaralan natin to. Tigi-isang chapter to, tigi-isang video to actually. Hindi kasama yung valid. Okay, kasama lang from letter B to letter E. So, tigi-isang video to. Isang video sa rescissible, voidable, unenforceable, and void. Okay? So, those are the different classifications of a contract. Now, let's move on to the stages of a contract. Okay? So, ano yung mga different stages ng contract? Number 1, we have preparation, conception, generation, / negotiation. So, yan yung mga certain terms na ginagamit dyan sa first stage na yan. So, preparation, conception, generation, negotiation. So, at this moment, number 1, meron na ba tayong contract? So, actually, wala pa. Wala pa tayong contract dito. Okay? Nagkakaroon lang ng kontrata dito sa number 2. Okay? Sa number 2, which is the perfection, birth, or formation. Usually, ang ginagawa lang sa number 1, yun, nag-uusap-usap pa lang yung dalawang parties kung anong magiging mga stipulations doon sa contract. Usually, yun yung kapag dinadraft pa lang yung contract, di ba? Pinag-uusapan kung anong meron, di ba? Kung anong magiging consequence, kapag hindi sumunod, di ba? Kung anong magiging benefit nila from the contract whatsoever. So yun, pinag-uusapan sa number 1. So number 2, usually, yan yung kapag pinirmahan na nung dalawang parties yung contract. Pero take note, ang contract pwedeng hindi siya in paper, di ba? Ang contract not necessarily pinipirmahan yan. Okay? So, wag kayong maglala pagdating natin ng chapter 2. Chapter 2 ba? Okay, so yan. Chapter 2 nga. Okay, or the next video. I-explain natin yan in great details, yung mga different essential elements. So, dun makikita yung mga yun. Okay? And number 3, we have consummation, death, or extinguishment. Pagdating dito sa number 3, lahat ng obligations within the contracts, okay, na-fulfill na, okay? Nagawa na natin lahat. So, ayan, fully consummated na yung contract natin or, ayun, extinguished na siya or, di ba, death, okay? So, ayan. Okay? So, pag nagawa na lahat ng obligations within the contracts. However, there are certain contracts na nag-expand siya indefinitely, okay? So, those are the stages of a contract. Ang tatandaan lang natin dito, ang main point lang natin dito is, kailan nagkakaroon ng contract? Sa number 2, stage 2, perfection, birth, or the formation of the contract, okay? So, last, we have the different characteristics of a contract. So, ayan, gumawa tayo ng parang tawag dito. Okay, so, mnemonics. Okay, so, Marcos, we have mutuality, autonomy, or liberty. We also call this the freedom to stipulate, yung number 2. Number 3, we have the relativity of contracts, consensuality, and the obligatory force. Okay, so, explain natin yan isa-isa. Let's start with mutuality of contracts. So, what is mutuality of contracts? The contract must bind both contracting parties. Its validity or compliance cannot be left to the will of one of them. Okay? Ibig sabihin, kapag may dalawang parties na pumapasok sa isang kontrata, hindi pwede na yung validity ng contract or yung compliance ng contract or kung ano man yung ini-stipulate within the contract ay nakarest lang sa isang tao. Hindi pwede na nakasalalay lang sa kanya. Hindi mo yung matatawag na kontrata kasi tatandaan nyo, ang kontrata ay mutual. Ibig sabihin, pinagkakasunduan yan ng dalawang parties. Kasi kung may isang bagay na hindi sila nagkasundo within the contract, hindi pwedeng maging effective yun. Okay? Or hindi pwedeng maging valid yun kung hindi sila nagkasundo doon. Okay? So, tatandaan nyo yun. That is mutuality of the contract. So, dapat lahat ng bagay within the contract na pagkasunduan ng dalawang parties, hindi pwedeng isa lang ang may gusto pero yung isa ayaw, pero valid pa rin siya. Or, di ba, effective pa rin yung stipulation na yun. Hindi po pwede yun. Okay? However, kung sakaling hindi magkasundo yung dalawang parties, pwedeng ibigay yung determination ng validity nun or compliance ng specific stipulation na yun within the contract to a third person. So, determination of a performance may be left to a third person whose decision shall not be binding unless it has been known to the both contracting parties. Pero, yun nga, kahit na binigay mo na yun to a third person na para mag-decide kung anong magiging stipulation natin or anong magiging itsura ng contract, kailangan yung third person na yun i-communicate niya pa rin sa inyong dalawa. At dapat, okay, ultimately, mapagkasunduan nyo pa rin. Kasi kung hindi nyo mapagkasunduan, hindi pa rin pwede, okay? Hindi pa rin magiging effective yun. So, tatandaan nyo yun. That is based on Article 1309. Okay? And, ayan. Lastly, the determination shall not be obligatory if it is evidently inequitable. In such cases, or in such case, the court shall decide what is equitable under the circumstances. So, kung sakaling hindi pa rin magkasundo, kasi yun nga, parang kumbaga feeling nung isang party, lugi siya dun sa kontrata, so ayun, pero yun nga, pwede silang pumunta sa korte, tapos yun, i-determine kung ano yung magiging equitable, okay? So, that is based on Article 1310. Okay, so as an example, ano ba yung mga key points na nakuha natin from the, okay? So, ayan. For example, S sold his parcel of land to B. Okay, it was agreed that X, a real estate appraiser, would be the one to determine the reasonable price of the land. Okay, so ang issue pala dito, si S and B, hindi magkasundo sa magiging price ng lupa. Kasi si S, although siya yung nagbebenta ng lupa, hindi niya rin kasi alam kung ano yung price. Hindi niya alam kung masyadong mataas ba yung bigay niya or hindi niya rin alam kung baka malugi siya dun sa Kaya, anong ginawa ni S and B? Okay? Para hindi mag-decide ang isa lang sa kanila, ang ginawa nila is nag-hire sila ng third person, which is si X, isang expert sa pag-a-appraise ng mga ganyang klaseng property. So, ayan. Si X, siya yung mag-a-appraise. Okay? Titignan niya ano ba talaga ang value ng lupang ito. So, ayan, si X. Pero, take note, okay, once na na-appraise ni X yung land na yan, at kunwari, meron nang binanggit na amount si X, let's say 5 million. Hindi ibig sabihin binding agad tong 5 million once na sinabi niya na 5 million. Kailangan, i-communicate niya muna yun both kay S, kay seller and buyer. Okay? At, ultimately, magde-decide pa rin si S and B kung magkakasundo sila doon sa 5 million. Okay? So, tatandaan nyo yun. That is based on yung naunang article dito, yung 1309. Okay? So, ayan. Yan yung example natin dyan. Okay? What if naman si X, kakonsyaba niya si B? Okay? Kakilala niya. So, sabi ni B, babaan mo, gawin mong 1 million lang. Parang ganun, okay? So, kapag feeling ni S, sobrang lugi naman siya doon, grabe naman yan. Punta na lang tayo sa korte, tignan natin kung anong ganito, ganyan, okay? Ano magiging equitable, okay? So, yun yung application naman ng 1310, okay? So, next, let's go to Autonomy of Contracts, or also called Liberty of Contracts, or the freedom to stipulate in contracts. So, the contracting parties may establish any stipulation or such stipulations, clauses, terms, and conditions as they may deem convenient, provided they are not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. So, in short, under the autonomy of contract, which is a characteristic of contract, pwede tayong gumawa ng kahit anong klaseng kasunduan. Okay, basta hindi ito labag sa batas, sa morals, good customs, public order, and public policy. So, tatandaan lang natin yun. Okay? So, that is number 2, autonomy of contracts. Let's go to the third one, the relativity of contracts. Okay? Under relativity of contracts, okay, so basahin muna natin yung guiding provision. Okay? So, Article 1131, paragraph 1. Okay, so contracts take effect only between the parties. Okay, their assigns and heirs, except in cases where the rights and obligations arising from the contract are not transmissible by their nature or by stipulation or by provision of the law. So the heir is not liable beyond the value of the property he received from the decedent. Okay, so explain muna natin before tayo mag-example dito sa last sentence na ito. Okay, so ang relativity of contracts po, ang sinasabi lang po niyan, ang kontrata ay nag-i-exist lang between the parties. Ibig sabihin, anuman ang meron or anuman ang benefit or anuman ang consequence dun sa kontrata na yon, ang involved lang yung dalawang parties lang na yon or yung mga assigns nila or heirs, di ba? In case na may namatay dun sa dalawang parties. Okay, so sasaluhin nila yung utang nung parents nila, parang ganun, or sasaluhin nila yung yung right to demand ng parents nila if ever yung creditor yung namatay. Okay, so inuulit ko, under the relativity of contracts, ano man ang maging benefit ng contract or the consequence within the contract, it shall be only between the parties. Okay, so that is a relativity of contracts. However, there are exemptions to this, pero mamaya na natin explain yung mga exemptions. Okay, let's deal muna with the yung transmissible whatsoever. Okay? So ayan. What are the key points? Yun nga nabanggit na natin. Yung key points na nakuha natin from the previous slide is contracts take effect between the parties in the contract only. However, there are exemptions which will be discussed later on. Okay? And nandito rin, contracts are generally transmissible. Okay? Unless they are made intransmissible by law, stipulation, or by nature. Okay? So, for example, what are the contracts that are not transmissible according to law? Okay? So, for example, ano ba yan? Contract. So, mag-example ba tayo? Actually, ang naisip ko palang example is yung right. Okay? Your right to vote in during elections. Okay? So, yun. Di ba? Your right to vote during elections, actually, it's not a contract, di ba? It's not actually a contract, pero yun yung parang naisip kong example dito. Okay, so wala pala akong example ng under the law. I-research muna natin to. Pero meron yun kasi nabanggit dito eh. Okay, so contracts are generally transmissible except hindi siya transmissible, sabi ng law. Okay, so ano kaya yung mga doon? Okay. Siguro merong mga certain nominate contracts in the future na kapag binasa natin yung mga guiding provisions under the civil code is hindi pala siya transmissible. Okay? So let's move on to the stipulation naman. So for example, actually meron tayong example dito. Mas madaling mag-isip ng example dito kapag ginawa siyang intransmissible by stipulation. So for example, meron tayong ang tawag dito yung sa gumawa tayo ng kontrata for what do you call this, yung kapag sa school, 'di ba, meron kang scholarship. Okay, so scholarship. So kapag sabi dun sa contract of scholarship na yun is hindi siya pwedeng ipasa sa iba. So that contract of scholarship is intransmissible. Hindi mo siya pwedeng ibigay sa iba. So usually yung mga contracts, yung mga scholarship granted by the government are intransmissible. Hindi siya pwedeng okay? Hindi siya pwedeng ipasa sa ibang tao. Okay? So, by its nature, ayun din. For example, ganito na lang. Ano ba yung example natin? Actually, nag-example na tayo last time dito, yung sa kasal din. Okay? So, for example, merong contract of marriage. Okay? So ayun. May sakit yung husband. So, pwede ba na mag-proxy ka muna? Or i-transmit yung right to attend the wedding? So, hindi. Because by its very nature, hindi pwede. Okay, kailangan personal 'yun, okay? So yun, tatandaan natin. Contracts are generally transmissible except ganito. Actually, napag-aralan na rin pala natin 'to sa obligation wherein obligations are generally transmissible then, okay, except ganito rin. Law, stipulation, and by nature, okay? So, and last, we have the heir is not liable beyond the value of the property he received from the decedent. So, decedent, we refer to the deceased person or yung namatay. Okay? So, for example, okay? Oh, ano nangyari? Okay, nawala yung example natin. Okay, so napunta na tayo sa X will not Okay, ito ba yung example natin din? Iba to, okay? So, for example, ganito lang, okay? In this third case, for example, meron kang, merong utang yung tatay mo, okay, na 500,000. Tapos, ang nangyari, yun nga, unfortunately, namatay. So, nag-iwan siya ng pamana sa'yo, which is 400,000. So, yung utang niya, yun, pumasa din sa'yo. Minana mo din yung utang na 500,000. Pero may minana kang 400,000. Pero lugi ka, di ba? Ang minana mo lang na asset ay 400,000. Pero may utang ka ng 500,000. So, sabi dito, the heir is not liable beyond the value of the property he received from the decedent. So, ganun lang yun. Ibig sabihin, kapag sisingilin ka ng kanyang creditor, okay, ang pwede mo lang, or ang obliged ka lang bayaran doon ay up to the extent ng na-receive mong property from your parent. Okay? So, that is based on article, yun nga, yung nabanggit natin, article 1131. Okay? So, next. Punta na tayo sa different exemptions under the Relativity of Contracts. So, balikan natin. Ano na nga ulit ang relativity? So, kung ano man yung mga magiging benefit ng contract or magiging consequence within the contract, ang pwede lang makatamasa or pwede lang panagutin doon is yung mga parties involved. However, there are exemptions to the rule. Meron tayong 4 na nabanggit dito sa slide na to. So, number 1, stipulation for Autrui. So, this is based on Article 1311, paragraph 2. So, what is stipulation for Autrui? Okay? Actually, stipulation for Autrui is the direct conferment of a benefit towards a third person. So, ayun, may involved na third person. Okay, yung third person na yun, dahil nagkaroon nga ng stipulation for Autrui, pwede siyang makatamasa ng benefit kasi yun yung definition ng stipulation for Autrui. From the contract, magbibigay ka ng benefit sa isang third person. Okay? So, ano ba ang requisites ng stipulation for Autrui? So, kailangan nag-exist lahat ito. So, there must be stipulation in favor of third person. Stipulation must be part, not in whole. So, the contracting parties must have clearly and deliberately conferred a favor upon a third person, not a mere incidental benefit or interest. Letter D, the third person must have communicated his acceptance to the obligor before its revocation. So, dapat kailangan din ng consent nung third person na yun. And lastly, no relation of agency exists between any of the parties and the third person. So, let's have an example. Okay, stipulation for Autrui. So, D is indebted to C for 1 million with 12% interest. It was stipulated that X will receive the 12% interest. So, this stipulation is accepted by X and duly communicated the acceptance to D and C. So, mukhang nakuha na natin yung first, second, and third requisites ng stipulation for Autrui. Okay, and bale, wala ring nabanggit na ganito, letter E. So, okay tayo dyan. Okay, actually, na-meet na lahat. So, obviously, meron tayong ditong stipulation for Autrui with regards to X. Okay, so si X, pwede na siyang maging involved dun sa contract. Di ba sabi sa Relativity of Contract, ano man ang mga magiging benefit or consequence ng isang kontrata ay para dun sa mga parties involved lang. Okay? Pero in this case, merong third party na naging involved sa contract kasi nga exemption ito pag merong stipulation for Autrui. So, after a year, so ano mangyayari? After a year, D&C decided to change the contract giving a specific house and lot. Okay? So, parang kumaga, nagkaroon ng novation, di ba? So, kung maalala nyo yung novation na topic natin last video. So, from payment of 1 million together with interest, ginawa na lang siya na payment of house and lot. Okay? So, under the Relativity of Contracts, third person cannot act upon that decision. Kasi, yun nga, yung kontrata ay between them only. However, this is an exemption. Okay? In this case, pwedeng hindi pumayag si X. Okay? Pero actually, dun sa novation, specifically dun sa novation, wala pa rin siya magagawa. Manonovate pa rin yung contract. However, yung benefit na matatamasa niya from having a 12% interest, mananatili pa rin yun sa kanya. Okay? Makukuha niya pa rin yun regardless of the novation. Okay? So, yun yung magiging benefit niya dito. Okay? So, yun yung stipulation for Autrui. So, next. This is the second one. When third person is in possession of a property and thus creating real rights. So, what do you mean by this? Okay? So, let's have an example para mas maintindihan nyo. S sold to B a specific land for 1 million. Okay? So, this is a contract between S and B only. Okay? So, ayan. B occupied the said land, okay, but did not register it. One day, okay, S sold the land or the same land to X. X registered the said property at the registry of deeds. Okay. So, pag napunta na tayo sa sales, ang mayroong mas right dito is yung second buyer, which is si X. Okay, dahil ni-register niya sa registry of deed. Okay, wala naman nabanggit dito na alam niya yung with regards to the first sale. So, in good faith siya. So, in this case, kung makapansin nyo, ganito. Tawag dito. Inoccupy ni B. Okay? Inoccupy ni B, di ba? Yun yung mapapansin nyo. Pero si X, hindi niya inoccupy, pero ni-register niya sa registry of deeds. Okay. Pagdating doon ni X, doon sa specific property na yun, nandun si B. Okay? Sabi ni B, sino ka? Ako yung may-ari nitong, ano na to? Sabi rin ni X, ako rin yung may-ari ng lupa na to. Binenta sa akin ni S, sabi nila. Okay? So, yan ang nangyari. Kung mapapansin nyo, although nagkaroon ng contract between S and B initially, pwedeng mag-intervene ang isang third person with regards to the contract. Okay? Pwede siyang makialam doon sa contract, although he is a third party with regards to the contract. Bakit? Kasi he is the rightful owner. Okay? He is the rightful owner of the land in this case. Okay? So si X, yun, pwede siyang makialam. Pwede niyang evict si B actually. Okay, in this case. Okay? So, that is yung second exemption natin. What is the third exemption? When contracts are entered to defraud, some creditors or to defraud creditors. Okay, tanggalin lang natin itong sum 1. Okay, so hindi natin nabura. Okay, so D is indebted to C for 1 million. D, fearing that he won't be able to pay his debt and ultimately his land being levied, sold the said land at a very low price to X with the condition that he can purchase it back. Okay. So, actually, ang parang main contract natin na tinitignan dito is yung contract between D and X. Okay. So, sabi natin, under the Relativity of Contracts, kapag merong contract between D and X, hindi pwedeng makialam ang third person. Okay? Pero, in this case, pwedeng makialam si C, which is a third party. Okay? So, bakit siya pwedeng makialam? Kasi, isa siyang creditor na na-defraud by the acts of D. Okay? So, hindi pwede. Actually, itong contract between D and X will be considered a rescissible contract. Pero, huwag kayong mag-alala, pag-aaralan natin yun under rescissible contracts kasi meron tayong separate chapter. Actually, isang buong video yung rescissible contract na yan. Okay? So, ayan. Si C, pwedeng mangialam between the contract of D and X because he is a creditor who was defrauded by the acts of D. So, yun lang yung very simple reason kung bakit naging exemption siya from the general rule na Relativity of Contracts. Okay? So, last. Okay? Third person induce a party to a contract to violate the contract. Okay? So, ano yan? Example tayo. Okay? So, ayan. After agreeing to sell his parcel of land to B, S sells the land to C instead because of the inducement of D. In this case, B can sue D for damages. Okay, so iyan na natin. I-analyze natin to. So, para makita natin yung, ano ba yung main contract na tinutukoy dito? Ang main contract na tinutukoy dito actually is yung contract between B and S with regards to the sale of land. Okay? So, ito yung contract. Pero ano nangyari sa contract na to? Hindi nag-comply yung isa. Okay? Instead, ano yung nangyari? S sells the land to C instead kay C niya binenta. So, hindi nag-comply yung isa. Okay? So, in this case, ganito. Di ba sabi natin kanina, hindi lang naman benefit, di ba? Pati consequence. So, in this case, pwede tayong mandamay ng third party, di ba? Usually, hindi tayo pwedeng magdamay ng third party because of the relativity of the contract na kapag yun nga, ang naging ano lang naman dito, sino ba ang naging hindi naging compliant? Si B, di ba? So, usually, siya yung isusun natin, siya yung kakasuhan natin. Pero, okay, under an exemption of the relativity of contract, pwede rin natin kasuhan yung third person na nag-induce sa kanya not to comply with this obligation. Okay? So, yun ang mangyayari. In this case, B can sue D for damages din. Okay? Pero, di ba, in general, when we base it on the relativity of contracts, hindi tayo pwedeng mangdamay ng third person. Okay? Pero, isa nga to sa exemption. Okay? So, this will be the last exemption dun sa relativity of contracts. So, yun. Next, okay? This is the fourth characteristic of a contract. So, we have consensuality of contract. When we say consensuality of contract, contracts are perfected by mere consent with regards to the object and the cause, di ba? Okay? So, ibig sabihin, actually, ito lang yung ito lang yung contracts are generally perfected by COC. Ano yung COC? Consent, object, and cause. Okay? Usually, yan lang. Yung tatlong lang yan ang essential elements. Okay? Yun yung consensuality. Okay? Pero may exemptions yung consensuality ng contracts. Ano? Yung nabanggit natin kanina na according to formation, di ba? Yung real contracts and formal contracts. Wherein ang real contract, in addition to COC, kailangan ng delivery. Tama? Okay? However, formal contracts, hindi naman siya ganon. COC plus, ano naman siya? Formalities. Okay? Formalities required by the law. Okay? So, these are the exemptions of the consensuality of contracts. Ang sinasabi lang, inuulit ko, ang sinasabi lang ng consensuality of contracts, ang contracts ay napaperfect generally ng COC lang. However, there are exemptions, real and formal contracts. Okay? So, next, punta na tayo sa huling uri or huling characteristic ng contract, which is the obligatory force of a contract. Okay? So, when we say obligatory force, kapag ikaw ay pumasok sa isang contract, okay, mababind ka na doon. Okay? Mababind ka na doon. Doon ka na. Kailangan mo nang mag-comply doon sa obligation mo and as well as reap the benefit kung may benefit man. Okay? So, actually, babalik tayo doon sa previous article or provision natin. Yung Article 1159. So, nasa umpisang-umpisa to, general provisions of obligations, okay? So, obligations arising from contracts have the force of law, okay? So, malinaw na malinaw yan. Force of law. So, parang nagkakaroon ng batas between, okay, those involved within the contract, okay? So, batas yan na kailangan mong sundin. Kasi kung hindi ka nag-comply, meron kang pananagutan, okay? So, between the contracting parties and should be complied with in good faith. At kapag mag-comply ka, dapat in good faith, okay? Kasi may mga times na yung pagko-comply mo may halong panlolokos, 'di ba? Okay? So yun yung last characteristic of a contract na i-discuss natin, okay? So this will be the end of the discussion of the general provisions of contract. So we have the essential elements of contract. So refresher lang, ano yung mga different elements of a contract last time? So we classified it into three. So we have the essential elements or the elements that are required in order for a contract to exist. We have also the natural elements which are initially existing in some certain contracts. However, it can be removed by the parties. And lastly, we have the accidental elements wherein they are the stipulations of the parties. Okay? So, ayan. Yun po yung mga different classifications of elements. However, in this video, we will focus on the three essential elements of a contract. Okay? So, what are the essential elements ulit? Article 1318. So, sabi niyan, nandito, we have the consent, object, and the cause. So, there is no contract. Okay? So, malinaw na malinaw. Nakasulat po sa 1318, there is no contract. Okay, kapag wala ang isa sa mga yan. Okay, ibig sabihin, required na required talaga siya. Okay, so ayan. First requisite natin is yung consent. So, ano ba yung mga different requisites ng consent? Under the Civil Code, so ayan, na makikita nyo dyan yung mga ranges ng different articles natin. So, bali, meron tayong tatlong requisite. Number 1, it must be manifested by the concurrence of the offer and acceptance. So, dapat merong offer and acceptance of the offer by the other party. Okay, number 2, the contracting parties must possess the necessary legal capacity. Ibig sabihin, meron silang capacity to enter the contract. Ibig sabihin, usually yung mga walang capacity to enter a contract is yung mga minor. Pag below 18 pa sila, hindi pa sila pwedeng pumasok sa isang kontrata. And lastly, we have it must be intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real, not vitiated. So, ang magko-cover nito ay Articles 1330 to 1346. However, for the third requisite natin, for the purpose of the voidable contracts, pagdating natin sa Chapter 7, I believe, hindi muna natin siya i-detalye masyado, pero babanggitin natin kung ano ba yung mga different vices of consent. Okay? Pero for now, yun nga, overview pa lang tong number 3. Okay? Magdi-detail tayo sa number 1 and number 2 requisites. Okay? So, ayan. So, let's start with the first requisite, yung manifestation of offer and acceptance. So, ayan. Unahin muna natin yung offer. Ano nga ba ang ibig sabihin ng offer? So, ang source po natin dito ay dictionary.law.com. So, an offer is a specific proposal to enter into an agreement with another. So, when we refer to the word agreement, we are referring to a contract. Okay? We are referring to a contract. So, basically, an offer is a proposal initiated by one party to another to enter into a contract. Okay? So, ganun lang po kasimple yun. So, for example, ayan, in-offer ko na bilihin ko na lang yung cellphone mo or bilihin ko na lang yung gadgets mo kasi medyo nagustuhan ko. Okay? So, offer po yun. So, nasa sayo yan kung i-accept mo yung offer ko. Kasi, unless na magkaroon ng acceptance, okay, inulit ko, unless magkaroon ng acceptance, hindi po magkakaroon ng consent. Okay? Okay? So, ayan, kung mapapansin nyo, yung offer, ini-initiate yan ng isang party at yung acceptance, gagawin yan nung kabilang party. So, both parties have a say on, okay, on the perfection of a contract or on the, yung first step pa lang tayo, syempre yung pag-gain ng consent. Okay? So, by the way, ang meaning ng acceptance ay agreeing verbally or in writing. Okay? So, ang acceptance pwedeng gawin verbally. Okay? Actually, this is true as well with offer. Pwedeng yung offer mo, verbal, pwede rin in writing yung offer mo. And ultimately, pagdating natin sa contracts, yun nga, yung mga different types of contracts, sabi ko nga last time, dun sa initial video natin, ang mga contracts, hindi po siya necessarily in writing or may pinipirmahan. Okay? So, okay lang na verbal din ang mga kontrata. Pero syempre, may mga certain contracts na kailangan in writing. Okay? For certain purposes, which will be tackled on the next video, which is Chapter 3, Forms of Contracts. Okay? So, ayan, acceptance, agreeing verbally or in writing to the terms of a contract, which is one of the requirements to show there was a contract. Okay? So, ganun lang kasimple yung acceptance. Okay? Acceptance ng offer. Okay? Pero, before we, syempre, although madali nga lang ang ibig sabihin nitong offer and acceptance, pero ano ba yung mga different requisites para masabi natin na ang isang offer ay isang offer. At ganun din ang acceptance, na ang isang acceptance ay magpuproduce ng isang perfected contract or perfected consent. I mean, kasi yun yung first step muna, di ba? Kasi meron pa tayong object and cause. Okay? So, ayan. So, ito yung offer. Sabi dito, note, an offer must be intentional, okay? Must be intentional and certain, okay? Must be intentional and certain. Okay? So, when we say intentional, okay, talagang gustong mag-offer nung kung sino man yung nag-o-offer na party. Okay? Gusto niya, parang kumbaga deliberate. Okay? Pag sinabi rin nating certain, ano ba yung offer? Okay? Pag tinignan ba natin or binasa ba natin yung offer or inanalyze ba natin yung offer, itong offer ba na to, ito yung certain siya as to yung mga necessary information para readily ma-accept natin. Okay? So for example, when offering to sell something, you should specify the object being sold. Okay? However, aside from this, kailangan din na certain ka as to amount or the price. Okay? So pag nagbebenta ka, dapat certain ka rin kung magkano mo siya gustong ibenta. Okay? So, ayan. Dapat ang offer ay intentional and certain. Kasi ganito yan. Paano i-accept nung, let's say, buyer, di ba? Paano i-accept nung buyer kung wala siyang i-accept na information such as kung ano ba yung binibenta or kung magkano yung binibenta. So, ganun lang po kasimple yun. An offer must be certain. Okay? Next. So, what are the special cases in case of offers? So, meron tayong 4 na special cases dito. First, the person making the offer may fix the time, place, and manner of acceptance, all of which must be complied with. So, this is based on Article 1321. So, ang number 1, ang gusto niya lang sabihin dyan is, pwede niyang i-specify, okay, kung paano i-accept nung kabilang party yung kanyang offer. Dahil kung hindi sumunod yung kabilang party dun sa manner ng acceptance na gusto niya, may chance, okay, ang mangyayari is hindi pa rin magkakaroon ng valid consent. At kapag walang consent, ibig sabihin, walang kontrata na nabuo. Kaya nga malinaw na malinaw dito, all of which must be complied with. So, kung ano yung manner of acceptance na gusto nung nag-offer, kailangan sundin yun nung nag-a-accept para magkaroon ng consent. Dahil kung hindi niya sinundan, hindi magkakaroon ng consent and ultimately, hindi magkakaroon ng contract. Okay? So, number 2, an offer made through an agent. So, by the way, when we are talking about the agent, actually, an agent is an extension of your personality. Okay? Ang agent po kasi merong separate topic po diyan. Okay? Usually this is taken along with law on sales, 'di ba? Usually that is yung pinakahuling law 4, okay? Pang law 4. So ayan. Okay, pero never mind. Okay? So, pag sinabi natin kasing agent, dahil, for example, ikaw ay isang entrepreneur and then, syempre, maraming transaction yung mga businesses mo. Hindi lang iisa yung businesses mo. So, usually, nagtatalaga ka ng mga agent to act on your behalf. Okay? So, when making an offer through an agent, okay, it is considered accepted from the time it is communicated to the agent. So, when referring to this, yung acceptance is communicated to him, yung him dyan, we are referring to the agent. Okay? Kasi ang general rule ganito. Okay? When making an offer, okay, yung acceptance, kailangan ma-communicate yun sa'yo na nag-offer. Kasi kung hindi yun na-communicate sa'yo, hindi pa nagkakaroon ng consent. Okay ba? So, hindi ibig sabihin na porket nag-offer ka, tapos inaccept niya, pero hindi mo pa alam na inaccept niya, hindi pa nagkakaroon ng consent doon. Okay? So, at that moment, wala pang perfected contract. Okay? Magkakaroon lang ng perfected contract once na yung acceptance na ginawa niya ay maiko-communicate sa'yo. Okay? Pero, in number 2, this is an exemption. Bakit? Kasi, nag-initiate ka ng offer using an agent, therefore, it is sufficient na mai-communicate doon sa agent na yun yung acceptance para magkaroon ng consent. Okay? So, exemption yung number 2 doon sa general rule natin wherein in order for consent to be made, kailangan ng communication ng acceptance to the offerer. Okay? So, exemption po yung number 2. Okay. Number 3. An offer becomes ineffective upon the death, civil interdiction, insanity, or insolvency of either. Okay, so nandiyan yung word na either party before acceptance is conveyed. Okay, before acceptance is conveyed, bago ma-communicate yung acceptance to the offerer. So this is based on Article 1323. So, for example, ganito. Nag-offer si seller kay buyer o ibenta ko na sa'yo tong lupa ko for 1 million. Okay? So, ayan. Si buyer, okay, binigyan ng ilang araw para, let's say, tanggapin yung offer. And then, ang nangyayari is, yun nga, namatay si seller. Bago nyo masabi na, oh, ina-accept ko, bibilihin ko na. Okay? So, namatay. Okay? So, isang ano lang yun, isang way lang. May other ways pa tayo, civil interdiction, insanity, or insolvency. So, namatay yung seller. So, at that moment, kasi, yun nga, namatay siya before the acceptance is conveyed, ibig sabihin, magiging ineffective na yung offer. Ibig sabihin, wala nang chance na magkaroon pa ng consent kasi patay na yung isang party na supposedly magiging party sa isang contract. Okay? So, ayun. So, ultimately, walang mabubuong kontrata. Okay? Next, number 4. Advertisement for bidders are simply invitations to make offers. So, this is based on Article 1326. So, anong ibig sabihin nito? Let's take an example. So, si S nagbebenta at a public auction a specific land. The starting bid is 1 million. A plays a bid which is 1,100,000. B plays 1,150,000 and C plays 1,300,000. So, in this case, automatically ba na magkakaroon ng contract between S and C? Okay? The answer is no. Okay? The answer is no. Okay? In this case, meron pa ring option si S na tanggihan. Okay? Yung 1,300,000. Because advertisement for bidders is only an invitation to make an offer. So basically, ang nangyayari, hindi si S ang nag-o-offer dito. Ang nag-o-offer si A, si B, and si C. So ito yung offer nila. 1,100,000, 1,150,000, and 1,300,000 offer. Offer yung mga yan. Okay? Na pending ng pag-accept ni S. So ayan. Nakasalalay kay S kung kaninong offer yung kanyang i-accept. Pero yun nga, normally, in auction, it is granted to the highest bidder. Okay? So, yun po yun. Okay? Tatandaan nyo yun. Next, let's go to acceptance. So, we have 3 notes here. So, number 1, an acceptance must be absolute. So, when we say absolute, in-accept mo lahat ng ino-offer. Okay? Kasi kung meron kang hindi in-accept kahit 1% nung ino-offer, kahit 1% lang, kahit 0.01%, basta hindi 100% ang pagtanggap mo, hindi pa rin magkakaroon ng tinatawag nating consent. Okay? And ultimately, hindi pa rin magkakaroon ng isang perfected contract. Okay? Dahil, yun nga, hindi absolute yung acceptance mo. Hindi absolute, hindi 100% yung pagtanggap mo. Okay? So, number 2. Okay? Although the offer was accepted, it wasn't communicated to the offerer. Okay? So, very important po yung number 2. Yun yung sinasabi ko kanina. As a general rule, nagkakaroon talaga ng consent once na nalaman ng offerer na inaccept na ni offeree yung kanyang offer. Okay? So, yun po yung number 2. Okay? Pero normally kasi kapag nag-uusap kayo, harap-harapan, normally it happens parang kumaga automatically na kapag sinabi mo, uy, ibenta ko na sa'yo yung lupa ko. Sige, magkano? Tapos ayun, sabi niya 1 million. Sige, saan yan? Saan yan naka-locate? Whatsoever. Sinabi niya na lahat ng incomplete information. Sabi pa rin ni buyer, sige, bilhin ko na. Okay? So, at that moment, syempre, yung pagkasabi niya, sige, bilhin ko na. At that moment, syempre, nalaman ka agad ng offerer, di ba? So, okay na yun. Nagkakaroon tayo ng consent doon sa instance na yun na sinabi ko. Okay? Number 3, acceptance may be expressed or implied. When we say express, talagang sinabi mo, expressly sinabi mo, okay, na tinatanggap mo yung offer. Okay? However, pag implied, It is your actions that implies, what do you call this? That implies acceptance. Okay? So, for example, ganito na lang. May nagbebenta sa'yo ng, let's say, saging. Okay? So, binebentahan ka ng saging. Wala kang sinasabi na acceptance. Parang kumaga, kuya, bili na kayo ng saging, 10 piso bawat kilo. Okay? So, wala akong idea sa 10 piso bawat kilo. Okay, so hindi ka umimik, pero ang ginawa mo, okay, kinuha mo, tapos binawasan mo, kinain mo pa ngayong isa, di ba? So, ang nangyari, through your actions, you are impliedly accepting the offer. So, we have already a perfected sale on that case, okay? So, yun po yung implied acceptance. Okay? So, next, ayan, ano to? Okay, so this is an illustration of yung an offer or an acceptance must be absolute. So S offers to B to sell his specific house and lot in Quezon City for 1,500,000. B accepted the offer but is only willing to buy the land. So in-accept niya nga pero hindi lahat. Yung land lang daw gusto niyang bilhin. So, in this case, wala pa tayong consent. Wala pa tayong nabubuong consent. So, therefore, wala pang contract. Actually, this is a counter offer. This is what we call a counter offer. Okay? Ang sabi niya kasi, pero willing lang siyang bilhin yung lupa. So, in this case, pag si S, okay lang siya doon sa bilihin lang yung land, ibig sabihin, the counter offer was accepted. If the counter offer was accepted, we have consensus. We have consent. Okay? So, in that case, it will lead us to the perfection of a contract. Okay? So, tatandaan nyo po yung term na yan, counter offer. Kapag hindi absolute yung acceptance, we have counter offer. So, at that moment, hindi pa naman ang huli ang lahat. Ibig sabihin, pwede pang i-accept nung offerer yung counter offer. Okay? Para magkaroon ng consent. Okay? So, next. How acceptance is communicated to offerer. Okay? So, ganito yan. Usually kasi pag nauusap kayo in person, yun nga, ang nangyayari kasi, immediately, once na in-accept niya yung offer mo, immediately, napupunta ka agad sa knowledge mo. Okay? Or na-i-communicate ka agad sa'yo yung acceptance. So, at that moment, parang kumbaga, sobrang bilis, nangyayari ka agad, nagkakaroon ng consent at that moment. Pero, may mga times wherein, hindi agad-agad, okay, na-i-communicate yung acceptance doon sa offerer. So, let's say, number 2 in this case. Okay? S, through letter, offered B to sell his land for 1 million. So, kailan niya ginawa and sinend yung letter? Nung January 1. Pero, na-receive lang yun ni B on January 15. So, one day after January 15, so gusto nang bilihin ni B. So, ayan, in-accept niya. Pero at that moment, January 16, hindi pa nagkaroon ng consent. Bakit? Inuulit ko nga kasi kailangan, okay, kailangan mapunta sa knowledge ng offerer na na-accept na yung kanyang offer. Okay? So, ayan, January 16, pinadala niya yung sulat, pero dumating lang ulit January 31. S receives the letter of acceptance on January 31. So, on January 31, dito magkakaroon ng consent. Okay? So, kung okay yung cause and object natin, at this moment, dito na rin magkakaroon ng tinatawag nating perfected contract. Okay? So, isingit natin ulit dito, what if before January 1, either kay B or S na baliw? Okay? So, babalikan natin yung rule natin na binanggit kanina. Okay? Before acceptance is conveyed at yun nga, nabaliw si either of the parties, whether in this case si B or si S, ang mangyayari, the offer becomes ineffective. So, kapag ineffective yung offer, hindi na magkakaroon ng consent and ultimately, hindi na magkakaroon ng contract. Okay? So, ayan. Ang reference point po natin dyan is January 31. That is the date when the offerer receives knowledge that his offer was accepted by the offeree. Okay? So, that's the time na magkakaroon ng perfected contract. Okay? So, ayan. So, promises in offer and acceptance. Okay? In contract kasi, pwedeng magkaroon ng mga tinatawag nating promises. So, yung mga promises na ito, hinati natin into 3. So, we have unilateral promises. Dinivide natin yung unilateral promises into 2. We have unaccepted unilateral promise and accepted unilateral promise. Okay? So, anong pagkakaiba nung tatlong ito? Okay? Actually, magkakaroon na tayo ng example dito, kaya focus muna tayo dito sa table. Okay? So, under unilateral promise unaccepted, okay, dito sa second column, ano ba to? Binding ba siya? Okay, so, yun yung intention natin dyan. So, bear with it. Okay, so, binding daw ba siya? Binding ba ang ganitong klaseng promise? Okay, the answer is no. In no case na magiging binding ito. Okay, 0% na magiging binding ito. And magkakaroon ba ng perfected contract? Dahil hindi siya binding, absolutely walang contract na mabubuo. Okay? So, next, punta tayo dun sa unilateral promise accepted naman. Okay? Ano itong unilateral promise accepted? Yung isang party nag-promise siya. Okay? So, mababind lang daw siya if the promise is supported by a consideration. Okay ba? Okay. Baka hindi nyo pa nagigets, pero huwag kayong mag-alala. After this slide, meron tayong example para maintindihan nyo itong sinasabi natin dito. Okay, so, ano ang mapa-perfect na contract? So, ang mapa-perfect na contract ay isang option contract only. Okay? I-explain din natin kung ano yung option contract maya-maya. And lastly, we have a bilateral promise, in which case, both parties promise. Okay? Made a promise to each other. Okay? So, binding ba? Yes, absolutely. It is binding without the need for consideration, unlike sa yung second row natin, di ba? Okay. So, binding contract of promise to enter into a contract. So, into a contract. Okay. So, ayan. Example tayo para mas maintindihan natin. Okay. S offers to sell his land to B for 1 million. Anong ginawa? B refused. Okay. However, S still insists that he is willing to give B 30 days to decide. Okay? So, actually, this is a promise. Okay? This is a promise. Okay? Sinabi niya, bibigyan niya pa rin ng, tawag dito, promise, parang kumbaga nag-promise pa rin siya na, willing pa rin siya na bigyan siya ng 30 days at, ayun, ready pa siyang ibenta yung land na yun for 1 million. Kay B, if in case nagbago yung isip niya. However, anong nangyari? However, si B, hindi, kahit na, ayaw ko. Hindi ko talaga bibilin yan, sabi niya. Okay? Pero, again, si S, hindi, okay lang. Okay? Marami pang pwedeng mangyari within 30 days. So, nandyan pa rin yung offer na yan. Or nandyan pa rin yung promise na yan pala. Okay? So, sabi niya, okay, nandyan pa rin. Okay? So, kung gusto mong bilhin, tawagan mo lang ako. Okay? So, yun. So, this is a perfect example of our first row kanina. This is a unilateral promise that is not accepted by the other party. Okay? So, a unilateral promise, ito yung unilateral promise. Okay? Ito naman yung instance ng hindi pag-accept. Di ba? Still refuse. Okay? So, this is also called policitasyon. Okay? So, in this case, there will be no instance wherein mababind. Kahit sino sa kanila hindi pwedeng mabind in a policitasyon. Ibig sabihin, for example, okay, again, S is still stand with his promise, sabi niya. Okay, pero let's say, after 15 days, sabi ni B, S, di ba may binibenta ka sa aking land? Oh, benta mo na sa akin. Okay, hindi siya pwedeng mabind. Kasi yung promise niya yun, hindi naman inaccept. Okay? So, this is basically a policitasyon. Okay? So, in this case, walang binding na magaganap, walang kontratang magaganap, walang commitment na magaganap kasi hindi inaccept yung promise nung kabilang party. Okay? So, ayan. Next, punta naman tayo dun sa pangalawang instance. Okay? So, S offers to sell his land to B for 1 million. B refused. However, S still insists that he is willing to give B 30 days to decide. Okay? Okay. So, ang pagkakaiba nito from the previous example, anong nangyayari? B accepted the promise. So, sige. Okay, sige. Bibiliin ko yan pag nagkapera ako within 30 days. Sabi niya. Okay? So, the question is, within 30 days, magiging binding ba itong unilateral promise na ito? The answer will be no. Okay? Although this is a unilateral promise accepted, okay, balikan natin yung kanina. Ano sabi ko? Okay? It is binding if promise is supported by a consideration. Okay? So, malinaw dyan. Okay? Binding if the promise is supported by a consideration. Pero in this case, kung mapapansin nyo, walang consideration that will support, okay, the promise. So, in this case, for example, within 30 days, okay, si B, sabi niya, o S, asan na yung lupa? Meron na akong 1 million. Okay? Si S, hindi na siya willing ibenta yung lupa. So, pwede bang i-compel ni B na ibenta sa kanya yung lupa dahil nag-promise si S? The answer is no. Hindi niya pwedeng i-compel si S for S promise kasi it is not supported by a consideration. Actually, that consideration is what we call an option money. Okay? That is what we call an option money. Okay? So, let's go to the next example. Okay? This time, nagkaroon ng option money. So, S offers to sell his land to B for 1 million. B refused. However, S still insists that he is willing to give B 30 days to decide. So, nagkaroon ng unilateral promise in this case. And that unilateral promise is accepted. Okay? And, additionally, this time, nagkaroon ng valuable consideration that will support the promise. So, 1,000 pesos na option money. So, in this case, the question is, mababind ba si S and B? Okay? Mababind ba si S sa kanyang promise? The answer is yes this time, di ba? Kasi, yun nga, merong option money to support the promise. Okay? And by the way, doon sa contract din, meron tayong nilagay doon na merong mabubuong kontrata. Pero hindi pa yun yung contract of sale. Di ba? Hindi pa ito contract of sale. Ito yung tinatawag nating option contract. Okay? Wherein, si B, meron siyang option whether to purchase, okay, the said land within 30 days. So, kapag naglaps na yung 30 days, mawawala na yung kanyang right dun sa option contract. Okay? So, yun po yung tatandaan nyo when it comes to unilateral promise accepted. Okay? Tignan nyo muna kung meron bang consideration or wala. Okay? So, last, punta tayo dun sa bilateral promise naman. S promised to sell his land to B for 1 million after 1 month. Likewise, B promised to buy S land for 1 million after 1 month. Okay, both of them made a promise to purchase and to buy the land. Okay, so in this case, we have a bilateral promise. And sabi ko, ang bilateral promise, binding na siya. Okay, without the need of a valuable consideration. Actually, this converts into a perfected contract. However, not a perfected contract of sale. It is still a contract that is, parang kumbaga, a binding contract that will bind them to sell the said property in the future, which is specifically 1 month. So, inuulit ko, this situation converts to a perfected contract, pero hindi pa directly doon sa tinatawag nating contract of sale. Okay? Magkakaroon pa tayo ng contract na tinatawag natin parang siguro contract to make a sale. Parang gano'n. Okay? Pero meron ng perfected contract. Ibig sabihin, mababind na si S and B within their promises. Okay? So, this is an example of bilateral promise. Okay? So, ayan. Next, punta tayo dun sa second requisite ng consent. So, we have the contracting parties must possess the necessary legal capacity. So, this is based from Articles 1327 to Article 1329. So, pag sinabi nating capacitated ang isang tao, ibig sabihin, capacitated siya or pwede siyang pumasok sa isang contract. Okay? Pero pag sinabi nating incapacitated ang isang tao to enter a contract, hindi siya pwedeng mag-enter into a contract. Okay? So actually, there are two kinds of incapacity. We have absolute incapacity and relative incapacity. So let's go first with the absolute incapacity, kung ano bang ibig sabihin yan. Okay? Pag sinabi nating absolute incapacity, okay, ito yung mga persons that are incapacitated to enter any kind of contract, kahit anong klaseng kontrata. Siyempre, may mga certain exemptions. So, generally, lahat ng contracts, hindi sila pwedeng pumasok. Pero may mga exemptions nga, inulit ko. Okay? So, first, number 1, mga minor, unemancipated minors. Okay? So, kahit anong klaseng kontrata, in general, hindi nila pwedeng pasukan. Except contracts involving necessary. For example, bumili sila ng pagkain. Okay? So, that contract is binding kasi it involves necessary, di ba? Pag bumili ng pagkain, bumili ng damit, bumili ng pangangailangan, bumili ng, let's say, edukasyon or ano pa, tirahan or whatsoever. So, ano na yung mga yan? Necessaries na yung mga yan. Okay? Or, when the minor, when entering into a contract, misrepresented his age. Nagloko siya, di ba? Sabi niya, 18 na siya pero hindi pa pala. Okay? So, it will bind him into a contract. So, actually, this is also called, what do you call this? Estoppel, okay? He will be liable, di ba? Parang kumbaga as if, ano nga siya, as if talagang meron siyang capacity to enter a contract, pero in reality, hindi pala. Okay? Pero magiging liable pa rin siya in this case kasi yun nga, kasalanan niya kung bakit nag-enter yung kabilang party kasi knowing that he is a minor or incapacitated to enter a contract, misrepresent niya yung kanyang age. Okay? That will induce the other party into entering the contract. Okay, so next, insane or demented person. Okay, so baliw or demented. So we have a person with usually yung Alzheimer, mga ganun, yung makakalimutin, mga ganun. Okay, so ayan. Okay, pero ang exemption natin dyan, yung lucid interval. So, ito yung lucid interval, ito yung time na yung baliw nasa katinuan. Okay? So, ayan. So, pwede kang makipagkontrata sa isang baliw habang nasa kanyang lucid interval or matino yung kanyang pag-iisip at that moment. Okay? And lastly, number 3, deaf mutes who do not know how to write. So, very specific tayo kasi maraming nagkakamaling estudyante. Ibahin lang natin ito ng konti, gawin lang natin who do not know how to read. Okay, makakalimutan na nila. So, very specific po tayo dito. Deaf mutes who do not know how to write. Okay, so tinanong ako last time ng estudyante ko, Sir, paano kung deaf mute who do not know how to read and write? Okay, so magpo-fall pa rin siya under number 3. Okay, so yung ano pa nga lang, who do not know how to write. Paano ba kaya kung who do not know how to read and write? So, hindi pa rin siya capacitated to enter into a contract kasi, ayun nga, as a minimum na meet yung deaf mute tapos who do not know how to write. Okay, so ayan. Next, relative incapacity. So, when we are talking about relative incapacity, there are persons who are generally capacitated to enter a contract. However, they are not capacitated to enter certain contracts. Okay? For example, ito nga, yung those under civil interdiction. Okay? Civil interdiction for transaction inter vivos. Okay, so revised penal code articles. Article 34, undischarged insolvent. So, mga may utang. And ito yung best example natin usually. Okay? So, husband and wife. Si husband and wife, malamang nakapagpakasal sila. So, they are not minors anymore, di ba? Ibig sabihin, generally capacitated na sila to enter into a contract unless baliw sila or who do not know how to write. Pero yun nga, in the first place, hindi naman sila makakapagpakasal kung incapacitated sila. So, husbands and wife are capacitated, di ba? However, in some certain contracts, such as contract of donation between each other, hindi po pwede. Okay? Hindi po pwede na pasukan nilang dalawa yan, yung contract of donation with each other. Okay? So, in this case, they are relatively incapacitated with this specific contract lang. Okay? And by the way, ang pagkakaiba ng absolutely incapacitated sa relatively incapacitated, okay? Kapag pumasok sa isang kontrata ang isang absolutely incapacitated person, yung magiging status ng contract na yun ay voidable. Okay? So, para sa mga nakakaalam na, para makita nyo although i-explain para ulit natin to, kasi yung mga first time na maglo-law on obligations and contracts, baka hindi nyo pa naiintindihan ang ibig sabihin ng or difference between a voidable contract and a void contract. Malamang sa bandang dulo pa yan na mga topics, okay? So, inuulit ko, kapag pumasok sa isang kontrata ang isang absolutely incapacitated person, the status of the contract will be voidable. However, if a relatively incapacitated person enters the contract, which is pinagbabawal sa kanya, for example, husband and wife, the status of the contract will be void. Okay, void. Okay? So yun ang pagkakaiba kapag absolutely incapacitated person pumasok sa isang kontrata, it is voidable. However, kapag relatively incapacitated such as husband and wife, pinasukan nila yung kontrata na pinagbabawal silang pasukan, that will be a void contract. Okay? So, tatandaan nyo po yan. Okay? So, next, let's go to the third requisite ng consent. So, it must be intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real, not vitiated. So, vices of consent, nabanggit siya from Articles 1330 to 1346. So, we have actually 5 vices of consent which will be discussed thoroughly pagdating natin sa voidable contract para may mapag-usapan tayo sa voidable contract. Okay? So, first, we have violence. In violence, there is physical force actually. So, for example, sinuntok ka, di ba? Sinuntok ka, binugbog ka, sinampal ka, tapos dahil doon, napapirma ka sa isang kontrata. Okay? Actually, it doesn't necessarily, itong mga vices of consent, it doesn't necessarily hinder the perfection of a contract. Actually, mapaperfect pa rin ang contract despite the presence of these, these vices. Itong 5 to. Okay? Mapaperfect pa rin yung contract. Yun nga lang, ang status nung contract na yun ay voidable. Okay? Ibig sabihin, pwede siyang ma-invalidate once na, nag-take ng action yung party na pwedeng magpa-invalidate nung specific contract na yun. Okay? So, first is violence. Yun nga, nasabi natin kapag merong physical force. Pag intimidation naman, walang physical force. However, merong parang kumbaga pagbabanta. Okay? Either sa'yo or sa mga kamag-anak mo or sa properties mo. Okay? So, merong pagbabanta. Kaya, napapirma ka sa isang kontrata or napa-oo ka sa isang kontrata. Okay? In mistake, ito naman, dapat yung mistake dito is, it's very substantial wherein, kung alam mo sana na may mistake, hindi mo papasukan yung kontrata siguro. Okay? So, ganun yung mistake. It's how it works. So, later on, pagdating natin ng voidable contracts, we will differentiate mistake that vitiate consent and mistake that do not vitiate consent. So, hindi porket mistake automatically, it vitiates the consent. Okay? So, when we refer to the mistake, under the vice of consent, we are referring to a mistake that will make or that will vitiate the consent and ultimately will make the status of the contract voidable. Okay? And next, ito, fraud, panloloko, okay? Pero, nung obligations, I believe we talk about 2 types of frauds. We have fraud, what do you call this? Fraud in obtaining consent, or usually we call that dolo cosante and the dolo incidente. However, okay, yung last time, yung nung sa obligations, we are referring to dolo incidente or fraud during the performance of an obligation. Pero pagdating dito sa consent, yung tinutukoy nating fraud dito is yung fraud in obtaining consent or the dolo costante. Okay? Pero i-explain natin ulit yan, refresher ulit yan pagdating ng voidable contracts. Okay? And lastly, undue influence. Okay? So, yan. So, for example, yung teacher mo, okay? Teacher mo, binentahan ka ng ganito. So, napa-oo ka na lang kasi nahihiya ka, parang ganun. Or, di ba, parang nakakahiyang tumanggi. Parang ganun. So, may undue influence doon. So, pwedeng maging ground yun for the annulment of a contract. Okay? So, those are the overview ng different vices of consent natin. Pero, later on the part of voidable contracts, i-detail po natin yan. Okay? So, let's move on to objects and cause. Okay, so, ayan. Ano nga ba ang object at cause? Kasi baka may mga nalilito pa rin kung ano nga ba ang object at ang cause. Okay, so, we have here two contracts. Okay, so, the first one is a contract of sale and the second one is a contract of lease. Okay, so, ganito. Tanong ko muna, okay? Post nyo muna itong video after nung tanong, tapos try nyo sagutin. In the first case, ano ang ating object? Okay? Contract of sale. So, post nyo muna yung video, sagutin nyo muna yun. Ano ang object? Okay? So, ang object natin dito ay yung LAN. Okay? The LAN. Okay? Sa pangalawang example natin, the contract of lease. So, this time, ano ang object natin? Okay? So, post nyo ulit ang video. Isipin nyo muna. Okay? So, the object here is also the LAN. Okay? Also, this LAN. Okay? However, what is the cause? Okay, ito na. What is the cause? Okay. The cause will depend. Okay? It depends. Okay? Are we referring to the perspective of S or the perspective of B? Okay? When we are referring to the perspective of S, the cost will be the price of the LAN. Okay? However, when we refer to the perspective of B, the cost will be the what? The delivery of the LAN. Okay? So, that's simple. Okay? So, depende yun. Yung cost, nakadepende po siya sa kung kaninong perspective. Okay? So, inuulit ko, si S, ang cost, kung bakit siya nag-enter into a contract, is because of the price of the LAN. Okay? Sana malinaw. And while for B, the cost for entering into a contract is for the delivery of the LAN. Okay ba? Okay, so next, punta tayo sa second type of contract na nilagay natin dito. So this time, ang tanong ko ulit, what is the cost? So again, it depends. Okay? So, for S, okay, for S, the cost for S as a lessor for entering in the contract of lease is, the yearly, okay, the yearly rent na 10,000. Okay, that's his cost. However, si B, what's his cost? Okay, the right to use the LAN, okay? So, yun lang ang pagkakaiba, di ba? Kasi ito, sale, malamang-lamang, delivery ng LAN, kasi sa kanya na yun. Okay? Pero dito sa contract of lease, yung use lang. Okay? Limited lang doon. Yun yung kanyang cost. Okay? So, sana, using this example, naliunawan po kung anong pagkakaiba ng object and the cost. Okay? So, by the way, ang object is also called, kung maalala nyo yung mga elements ng obligations natin, yun nga, yung prestation, pwede ring prestation yan, or pwede ring subject matter. Okay? So, ayan. Next, punta tayo sa object. What are the requisites of an object? So, number 1, an object must be lawful. Pag sinabi nating lawful, ayun, not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. Okay? So, may mga na-example na tayo last time sa mga obligations topic ng mga unlawful, di ba? Unlawful na ganyan. Okay? So, for example, bawal magbenta ng shabu. Okay? So, malamang lang kasi it is contrary to law. Bawal magbenta ng, let's say, mga organs. Kasi aside from law, bawal siya. O bawal din. Siguro sa morals or Diba? For example, magbenta ng fetus, 'di ba? Meron ganun sa yung sa China ata 'yun. Okay? So hindi ako sure. Okay? Pero 'yun, nababasa-basa lang. Okay? So 'yun, 'di ba? Hindi lang siya against sa morals, against siya sa kung ano-ano pa dito. Okay? So ayan. Magbenta ng ano pa ba? Ng laman. Syempre, 'yun, morals 'yun. Okay? So 'yun yung mga 'yun, mga bawal. Okay? So kapag ganun ng object natin, hindi pwede. Hindi magkakaroon ng isang valid contract. Okay? So number 2, actual or possible. Okay? So possible ba yung object na yan? So for example, yun nga, ang contract natin, ang object ng contract natin is star, the star, actual stars in the sky. So hindi pwede, hindi siya possible. Okay? Next, number 3, transmissible or within the commerce of man. Okay, so pwede bang maging object ng contract ang, let's say, your right to vote during elections. Okay, actually, the right to vote during elections is intransmissible. So, therefore, hindi siya pwedeng maging object ng isang contract. And also, it is personal in nature. Okay, pag namatay ka, okay, yung right mo na yun ay mababaon hanggang sa hukay mo. So, hindi na pwedeng gamitin yung right mo na yun para gawing pamboto ng iba. Pero yun nga, may mga issue last time na yun nga, yung mga namatay na tao, yung mga hindi na registered, mga ganun. Nakakaboto pa rin, sabi nila. Okay? Pero never mind. Okay, number 4, determinate or determinable. Okay? So, yung object natin dapat determinate, hindi siya generic kasi for example, nagbebenta ka pero generic at that moment na kahit anong basta bebentahan kita ng ito. Okay? Malay ba natin kung anong specific yan? Baka may sira yan or kailangan makita natin yung specific na bagay na yun, di ba? Yung mismong bagay na yun. Okay, makita natin. Okay, magawang determinate siya. Kasi kung ano man ang mangyari sa bagay na yun, yun nga, for example, nawala siya via fortuitous event, yun nga, di ba? Ma-extinguish na yung obligation or whatsoever. Okay, so it must be determinate or capable of being made determinate. Okay? Okay, so ayan. So special case tayo. Future inheritance. Pwede bang maging object of a contract? The answer is no. Okay? A future inheritance cannot be an object of a contract. So, ang example po ng future inheritance, for example this, X is the son of Y. Y is still alive. Okay? However, si X, binenta niya yung inheritance niya kay Z. So, in that case, yung contract of sale between X and Z, actually, wala yan. Non-existent yung contract na yan. Okay? Hindi valid. Hindi valid yung contract na yan dahil, okay, ang object ng kanilang contract ay isang future inheritance. So, paano ba natin masasabi na ito ay isang future inheritance? Simple lang. Tignan natin. Si Y, buhay pa. So, future inheritance pa yan. Pero once na namatay si Y, at that very moment, hindi na siya future inheritance. Okay? So, pwede na siya maging object ng isang kontrata. Okay? So, sana, simple lang yung concept ng future inheritance natin. Okay. So, punta tayo sa cause. So, what will be the cause? Actually, nakapag-example tayo kanina nung binabanggit natin yung difference between an object and a cause, okay? Actually, yung cause, it depends upon the type of contract. So, last time, yung initial video natin, yung first video natin under contracts, di ba? Kinlassify natin yung mga different contracts. So, meron tayong isang classification doon wherein it was classified according to the cause. So, ito na nga yun. So, mga onerous contracts, gratuitous contracts, and remuneratory contracts. Okay, so unahin muna natin yung onerous. Pag sinabi natin onerous, usually each party receives a valuable consideration. Okay? So, andito, as to each of the contracting parties is understood to be the undertaking or the promise of the thing or service by the other party. Okay, so yun nga, in example natin kanina sa contract of sale, ang cost para kay seller is the price of the thing, while the cost sa perspective ni buyer is the promise. Okay, the promise of the thing, di ba? Of the thing. Okay, the promise of the thing, the delivery of the land, okay, specifically. Okay, however, in gratuitous, simple lang ang cost, okay? Yung kabilang party naman kasi, wala naman siyang i-give up, so, ang cost dito is, okay, nabaliktad natin. Okay, so this is gratuitous. And this is onerous. So, mere liberality of the benefactor or the pure generosity of the tawag dito, of the donor, pag if ever it is a donation, di ba? Okay, so that is the cost. Okay, however, in remuneratory, so it is the service or benefit which is remunerated. So meron tayong ibang term na ginamit dyan last time, or which is yung services or benefit already acquired or done, parang ganun, di ba? So, for example, yun nga in a contract of employment, okay, so once na nakapag-render na ng service yung mga ano mo, okay, so that is the cost kung bakit ka magbibigay or, di ba, magpapasahod, okay? So, those are the three, okay, classifications of contracts according to their costs, okay? So, what are the requisites of cost? So, number 1, it must be existing, lawful, and number 3, it must be true, okay? So, actually, itong number 1 and number 3, I mean, is almost almost synonymous sila, pero when we are referring to the existence of the cost, we are actually referring on the actual existence of the cost. So, mamaya, explain natin, okay? However, when we are talking about if the cost is true, not false, okay? Ibig sabihin, kung ano man yung nabanggit doon sa contract, it is actually the true cost, okay, in the contract. So, example tayo. Okay, ano ba yan? Cost versus motive kaagad, okay? So, ayan. So, for example, sabi natin si X, paano ba yun? Si X, magdi-deliver daw siya ng i-deliver niya daw yung, let's say, X will deliver sugar, okay, sugar to Y, okay? Bakit? Anong cost? Kasi, yun nga, nagbayad si Y, okay? Nagbayad si Y, let's say, ng 100 peso per kilo, okay? Per kilo ng sugar, okay? So, yun yung cost daw, okay? So, in here, dapat, yung cost na yan, yung nagbayad ng 100 peso per kilo, ay talagang dapat nag-i-exist. Talagang nakapagbayad nga talaga si Y kay X. Kasi kung hindi, okay? Kasi kung hindi, ibig sabihin, the cost is actually not existing. Okay? The cost is actually not existing. Ibig sabihin, kung it is not existing dahil requisite yan ng cost, ibig sabihin, walang cost. Okay? At kung walang cost, hindi magkakaroon ng perfected contract. Okay? Yung number 2, malamang very easy to digest lang yung number 2 kasi it must be lawful. The cost must be lawful. Okay? So, for example, yun nga, nag-deliver ako ng sugar, pero ang kapalit, let's say, marijuana or what, di ba? Or, magiging mistress or whatsoever, di ba? Lahat na ng illegal na pwede nyo maisip. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, hindi magkakaroon ng perfected contract in that case. Okay? Kasi it's not lawful. So, number 2. Okay. So, ano naman yung number 3? Sabi ko, it is somewhat. Okay? Actually, pares lang yan sa number 1. Okay? Ang pagkakaiba lang is yung number 3 where we are actually referring to the statement, okay, to the statement in a contract. So, for example, sabi dito, X deliver a sugar, okay, X deliver a sugar to Y, okay, because of binanggit niya, yung kanina hindi natin binanggit yung 100, okay, so binanggit niya mismo dun sa contract 100 kilogram, pero actually in reality ganito, in reality hindi 100 peso, okay, kundi nag-barter or nagbigay din siya ng, let's say, what do you call this, hindi pera yung binayad niya, let's say nagbigay din ng bigas, okay, rice, okay. So, in this case, may chance na baka ito ay isang contract, hindi contract of sale, baka ito ay barter, may chance na ganun, okay? So, yun nga, in this case kasi, the stated cost is not true. So, therefore, may chance na ma-invalidate tong contract na to. Actually, may invalidate siya with regards to being a contract of sale, okay?
So in this case, it will be parang kumbaga mako-convert siya into a contract of barter kung barter nga ba ito. Yun yung intention, parang ganun. Okay? So that is the difference between number 1 and number 3. Existing, the cause must be existing, and number 3, the cause must be true, not false. Okay? So ayan. Next. Last, punta tayo sa last concept under cause. Cause versus motive. So, nabanggit natin yung motive. Ano ba yung motive? In Tagalog, motibo. Okay, so for example, X buys a gun from an arms dealer and procured the necessary permit. So, ayan, what do you call this? So, X entered into the contract because, so yun, para ma-deliver sa kanya yung gun, magkaroon siya ng gun. Pero, more, parang kumbaga, more personal, let's say, a more personal reason kung bakit niya binili yung gun na yun is gagamitin niya for assassination, for example. Okay, so in that case, the personal reason na binanggit natin, which is the assassination, it will be the motive, okay, in the contract. However, okay, the motive does not affect the status of the contract. It doesn't matter if the motive is illegal. Okay, wala tayong paki doon. Kahit na illegal yung motive, the contract will remain to be valid because the cause is lawful, which is yun nga. Na-acquire naman yung necessary permit. Tapos, malamang yung arms dealer na to is legal naman siya, okay? So, talagang nagbebenta siya ng baril, okay? So, ayun, yun yung pagkakaiba ng cause and motive. And usually, yung cause, tawag dito, usually yung cause, usually known siya for both parties, okay? Pero yung motive, yung party lang, kung kanino yung motive na yun. Siya lang nakakaalam usually. Okay? So, yun yung mga, okay? Pero ang pinaka tatandaan nyo na lang na pagkakaiba ng dalawang yan is, yung motive, hindi niya naapektuhan yung validity ng contract. Ganun lang yun. Okay? Kasi, hindi naman siya essential requisite ng isang contract. Okay? Pero part siya ng contract. Okay?